This is the second part of ISIS, nation building, and the Great Sorting Out. And in this video, I hope to explain to you, or argue, how I see the Great Sorting Out taking place in the Middle East, and how I see ISIS emerging out of this Great Sorting Out in this nation building process. If we look at Anatolia, that is what is Turkey today, the center of the Ottoman Empire, which was ruled from Istanbul. We see that about 20% of the population of Anatolia in 1914, that's before World War I, before the nation-building process under Ataturk, was Christian. 20% of the population was Christian. By 1923, 23, by the time Ataturk, the father of Turkish nationalism, consolidates a Turkish constitution and new government, new army, and pacifies Anatolia, all those Christians are gone. They're ethnically cleansed. And this brings us back to the argument I made in the last video, that the nation-building process launches really a great sorting out, which is an effort to create a common organic political community, which is intolerant to minorities who have sub-national loyalties. And they often get driven out, and they're accused of being a fifth column. That means a helper to some foreign power, because they often call on foreign powers to come help them in this struggle over national supremacy. We see that in Anatolia. In the east of Anatolia, you have the Armenians, about 1.5 million Armenians. The Armenians are accused of siding with the Russians in World War I, the major antagonist to the Ottomans. They're accused by the Ottomans of calling on the Russians to come in and help them build their own Armenian nation. So what do the Ottomans do? They move their armies over to the Armenian east, and they drive out the Armenians. Most of them die on the way, are attacked by bandits, or are robbed by the military. They die, or some of them, a small amount, end up managing to make it out of Anatolia. In the west of the country, the Greek Orthodox are also destroyed, and a big population transfer of 1.5 million Greek Orthodox moved out of Anatolia, sent to Greece. 800,000 Muslims that are in Greece. It must be remembered that Greece was under the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years, had many Muslims in it. They, 800,000, were sent to Anatolia. At the end of World War I, the Greeks invaded Anatolia. They thought they could easily conquer this defeated empire and rebuild the Byzantine Empire. This effort only sparks Ataturk to galvanize the Turkish people together. The Ottoman Empire, it has to be remembered, had been defeated by the British. The British were occupying Istanbul. They had the Sultan under house arrest, and they had disbanded the entire Ottoman army. So Anatolia was in complete chaos. There were bandits riding around everywhere. People were poor and starving. Ataturk emerges out of this, galvanizes the people together, and becomes the George Washington of a modern Turkish republic. The Greeks fight all the way almost to Ankara in the center of Anatolia. They're driven out, and as they're driven out by this new Turkish army, all the Greek Orthodox who'd lived there for thousands of years are kicked out of the country, ethnically cleansed. Zero-sum game for the minorities, long and bloody. Turkey today has no Christians, virtually none. There's less than 1%. The Kurds, a different ethnic group, Sunni Muslims, but Kurdish, have still not been fully digested. And there is a long-running, simmering war going on in eastern Turkey between Kurds and Turks. But that's part of this great sorting out in the Middle East. If we quickly jump over to Cyprus, you can see on this slide Cyprus as it existed before the Great Sorting Out. In 1860, this ethnic picture shows you where Muslims and Greeks on Cyprus live together. The Muslims depicted in green are scattered about little Muslim villages interspersed amongst the Christian villages. Rise of nationalism, Turkish invasion in 1973, boom. All the Muslims driven out of southern Cyprus go to the north, the green part. All the Christians driven out of the north and collect in the south. Here is a very stark depiction of the great sorting out of nationalism, dividing peoples along ethnic and religious lines. Let us jump over to Lebanon. I'm not going to take your time trying to explain this because it's too complicated for this short lecture. But let me just say that in the 11 lands, the lands of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, in every one of these states, minorities rise to the top and capture the state. And that is because of colonial occupation. In the interwar years, unlike in Central Europe, all of these lands were occupied by Britain or France, which got mandates from the League of Nations to rule over them. France ruled over Lebanon and Syria, and Britain got Iraq, Jordan, Palestine. In every case, the colonial powers tried to divide and conquer, to rule through giving the minorities a leg up, such that when the colonial powers left and gave independence to these lands in 1945-6, the minorities were able to grab power and rule. And what we've been seeing more recently is uprisings in every one of these countries to try to throw off that minoritarian rule on the part of the majority population that's trying to take power. In Lebanon, it was the Christians, the Maronite Catholic Christians, who got the leg up, got the lion's share of power in Lebanon, and ruled the country after independence in 1946. In 1975, the Muslims were already a majority. They call for one man, one vote, and a dissolution of Christian power. The Christians refuse, civil war. Lebanon goes through a 15-year brutal civil war. 150,000 people out of 3 million are ethnically cleansed, forced to flee the country. Many more hundreds of thousands are forced to move around internally. And the war only comes to an end in 1990 after 15 long, brutal years. The great sorting out is not complete. Foreign armies move in, particularly the Syrian army, and put an end to the fighting, and have maintained Lebanon as a land of multi-ethnic groups, multi-religious groups. If we look at Iraq, you can see from this ethnic map that the Sunnis in the yellow part, in the west, Sunni Arabs are about 20% of the population. Shiite Arabs, 60% in the green, and in the north, the purple part, Kurds. These three different groups, before the US invasion, are ruled over by Saddam Hussein, who's a Sunni, part of that yellow part. And the Ba'ath Party and the Iraqi army are dominated by Sunnis at the top. So they are instruments of Sunni rule. When the United States invades in 2003, they claim to be trying to introduce democracy, get rid of the Sunni tyranny of Saddam Hussein, and get some kind of power sharing. They believe that they can build a better government for Iraq. But what happens is that the United States triggers this inter-ethnic war. Turns out to be very brutal, and that sparks the great sorting out in Iraq. The Sunnis, who are cast from the top of the society down to the bottom, join al-Qaeda and fight to drive the Americans out, thinking that they can retake the state. This launches this terrible war between the Shiites and the Sunnis. And the Kurds, of course, grab autonomy and quasi-independence in the north. The United States beats down the Sunnis, defeats al-Qaeda almost, 2010, leaves leaves a Shiite-dominated government in Baghdad. But what happens? ISIS regrows in Syria and reinvades in 2014. In the summer of 2014, ISIS sweeps over the entire Sunni majority part of Iraq. There's almost not a shot fired. In the major cities of Mosul, Ramadi, Tikrit, ISIS sweeps right in, takes over. Why? Because the Sunni Iraqis see ISIS as a champion, as better for them than the Shiite-dominated government, who they see as persecutors. And that is really a story of nation building, a story of the great sorting out and fighting between these three different groups for who owns the country. How is it going to be defined? What kind of organic political community are we going to have? And that fighting is not over. Today, it looks like, with American help, the Shiites will smash the Sunnis. And that's what's happening in Western Iraq. America and the American Air Force and Special Forces are killing ISIS, which represents Sunni Iraq, driving them out of these Sunni cities, and the Shiites are taking them over. In Ramadi, which was taken in 2015, end of 2015, beginning of 2016, 80% of all the housing stock was destroyed by American bombing and Shiite militias that took revenge on ISIS strongholds and that blew up houses rather than enter into them, thinking that they would be have landmines in them. So this is not ethnic cleansing, but it looks something similar to ethnic cleansing in the Sunni parts of Iraq. We don't know how this story will end. Most of the refugees that have been flowing into Europe from both Iraq and Syria are Sunni Arab refugees who are fleeing this fighting. Let me try to shoehorn in here for a few seconds the Arab-Israeli conflict into this larger argument I'm making about the great sorting out, about nation building. Palestine, 1850, if we go back before the rise of Zionism, of Jewish nationalism, Palestine is only 4 or 5% Jewish. Only about 15,000 Jews live in Palestine in 1850. By 1914, World War I, 14% Jewish. Jews have been trickling in, but not in giant numbers. By 1948, when the British leave Palestine, 33% of the population is Jewish. We have to remember that the Holocaust has taken place. Hitler rises in 1933, and Jews begin to come in large numbers to Palestine. Now, once the British leave in 48, the Palestinians, who are 2/3 of the population, believe that they're going to be able to dominate and win and assert their control over all of Palestine. War breaks out in 1948, and the Jews win spectacularly. The Palestinians lose. 800,000 Palestinians become refugees. They flee or are kicked out, never to be allowed back in again. That's 2/3 of the Palestinian population. The Jews are the only minority, religious minority in the Middle East, that are able to turn themselves into a majority. Now, to be fair to the Jews, we have to remember that the Jews have already been sorted out. In Central Europe, Holocaust, 6 million dead, and others flee. When the United States closes its doors to immigration in the 1920s, the Jews have nowhere to go, and they begin going to Palestine. At the end of World War II, Truman calls for displaced people, the Jewish displaced people that are left in Europe, should go to Palestine. But Middle Eastern Jews have also been sorted out. It's important to remember that in 1914, for example, in Baghdad, the single largest religious community in Baghdad in 1914 was the Jewish community. It was bigger than the Shiites, the Sunnis, Kurdish community. There's not one Jew left in Baghdad or in Iraq. Same thing for Syria, Yemen, all the Arab countries. There are small Jewish populations in Tunisia and Morocco today still. Istanbul, Tehran, larger Jewish populations. But by and large, the Jews of the Middle East have been sorted out already. They were the first to go. And they left to Palestine. Half of the Jews of Palestine today are Middle Eastern Jews. The other half are from Europe. That's a bad story for the Palestinians. They become a minority, long and bloody, zero-sum game. The Palestinians today are still fighting for a state, and for the last 50 years, they've been fighting against the Jews of Palestine, trying to get a hunk of that state back for themselves. Will there be a two-state solution? Will they get a state? I don't know the answer to that, but it looks unlikely today. That brings us to our last country, Syria. Here, the minority of interest are the Alawites. They are a heterodox Shiite group that are not considered to be Muslims by the majority Sunnis, at least not theocratically throughout the great tradition of Sunni history, the great sweep of Sunni history. The Alawites are about 12% of the Syrian population. They live on the coast in the area that's depicted in green here, north of Lebanon and just south of Turkey. There are some Alawites in Turkey going up to Iskenderun. How do these Alawites get power, which they have today? Bashar al-Assad and his father, Hafez al-Assad, both Alawites. In 1920, when the French take over Syria, the Alawites are the poorest of the poor. They are the dirt farmers. There are only about 20 miles of packed dirt road in all of the coastal region. Everything else is like little donkey tracks. Only about 20 or 30 Alawites have a secondary school education. Very backwards and deprived population. In nowhere do Alawites and Sunnis live together. In no town of over 200 people do they live together. Is there an Alawite and a Sunni quarter in the same town? Christians and Alawites live together, Ismailis and Alawites, Christians and Sunnis, but not Alawites and Sunnis. And that's in part because they're seen to be ghulu, an extremist group that is beyond the bounds of religion. So how does this poor community of the coast become the rulers of Syria? As we said, colonial powers, the French, divide and conquer. They split Syria up along ethnic lines, and they build an army. And into that army floods minorities of all kinds. The Alawites, Armenians, Christians, Sunnis from the countryside who are willing to fight against Sunnis of the cities. And this creates a situation in which the military has tons of minorities. They're overrepresented. When the French leave in 1946, there are a number of coups d'etats that strike Syria. Already in 1949, there's 3. There are about 20 successful, unsuccessful coups d'etats stretching between 1949 and 1970, when the Alawites, who've risen to the top of the leadership, grab power. Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, who rules Syria today, seizes power in a coup d'etat. In order to consolidate that power, he puts his brother in the head of the intelligence, other relatives in the top security positions, and he jams the upper ranks of the military with Alawites. The Mukhabarat, the secret police, are also jammed with Alawites at the top. So the security state is heavily larded with Alawites at the top. The face of the government, the cabinet, the prime minister, Sunni Arabs predominantly. The economy dominated by Sunni Arabs. And that is an unspoken rule or balance that is created by the Assads. But they hold on to power through traditional loyalties to the president and his sectarian group. That situation explodes in 2011 with the Arab Spring. Due to a number of economic factors, which we won't go into, the Sunni majority population rises up and demands change. Isqat al-Nizam. May the political order, the regime, fall. They want to get rid of Bashar. Irhal is the most predominant slogan of the demonstrations, which is "Get out, Bashar, get out," and a desire for dignity and freedom, hurriya. Those are the slogans of this uprising, and it is a massive uprising that reaches into Alawite areas, Christian areas, but as soon as it becomes violent, because the regime looks at this uprising and thinks, oh my God, if we're thrown out, the radicals will take over. It'll be like Iraq. We'll be ethnically cleansed in the same way that Sunnis are being driven from power with the overturning of the Ba'athist regime in Iraq, or the way Armenians, Greek Orthodox, were driven out of Anatolia, or the Palestinians from Palestine. So the Alawites shoot, and they try to suppress, and it turns into a bloody civil war. And increasingly, the minorities, many of whom wanted to see an end of this corrupt and oppressive dictator, begin to move out of the ranks of the demonstrators and back under the fold of the regime, because it quickly takes on the sectarian language. The rebel groups dominated by Sunni Muslims. The government dominated by the religious minorities. Now, much of the rank and file of the military is still Sunni, and there is an important element of the Sunni community, the business that does not, and the rank and file army that do not abandon the regime. And that has turned this into a terribly long civil war. 6 years. The Russians, of course, have jumped in. The Iranians have jumped in. Shiites from every side, from Lebanon with Hezbollah, from Iraq with Ahl al-Haq and other militias, the Iranian army, have all come to the rescue of this small Shiite minority in Syria to build what is today a larger arc dominated by Iran, stretching from Lebanon through Syria, Iraq, Iran. And this, out of this uprising in Syria, we see minorities in the region disappearing. This larger sorting out, as I would argue, nation-building process of trying to build a political community where people share ethnicity, religion, so forth, a common organic community. Minorities are driven out. Here is a little graph of what's happened to Christians in the Middle East. In Egypt, Christians were about 20%, World War I. They've gone down to about 8, 7% today. In Syria, 15% at the end of World War II, down to about 3% today. Palestine almost disappeared, we're 10%. And that's true for every Arab country of the Levant, where Christians were an important part of society. And today, they've almost disappeared. The only countries that you see gaining Christians are Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, and of course they're not getting citizenship. They're just workers in these oil-rich states. So Christians are leaving the Middle East. Let's look at ISIS in our conclusion to this great sorting out article. ISIS, in this map, as you see before you, conquered the big swaths of Sunni tribal region stretching between Baghdad in Iraq to Aleppo in the north of Syria and Damascus down the south. All of that Sunni majority territory in the middle was conquered by ISIS that wanted to build a caliphate and reestablish virtuous rule of the Quran Sharia law. That was the argument. But of course, it was a very militant group by this time that had grown up in Afghanistan, then fighting Americans in Iraq, and copying some of the military institutions of the Ba'athist regimes they had inherited, in a sense. But you see in this map, the Kurds have hived off in the north. All the yellow areas in the north of Iraq and the north of Syria, predominantly Kurdish. They have their own military, de facto independence today. The Shiite-dominated areas, the purple in Iraq and the red, still dominated by the Syrian army led by Bashar al-Assad, along the western coast of Syria are like two bookends or vice grips squeezing the Sunni state in the middle. Now, the United States is going to war on the side of the Shiites in Iraq, the Baghdad government, and are bombing that big black blob to destroy ISIS. The Russians have entered in on the side of Bashar al-Assad's regime, the Shiites of Syria, in order to destroy all the rebel groups, the Sunni rebel groups in Syria. So in a sense, the United States, in linking up with the Shiites of Iraq, is doing the same thing that Russia is doing in Syria by linking up with Assad and the Shiites of Syria in order to destroy this Sunni rebellion and an attempt by Sunnis to gain their own state in this multi-ethnic, multi-religious land. They're being destroyed today. That big black blob is about half today while I'm giving this lecture in beginning of 2017. Very possibly by the time you watch this, it'll be much, much smaller. Today, it's half the size of this. Let's see if I have a map. You can see here what remains, the red parts, but it's shrinking all the time. So let me conclude. I've made an argument for you. I've tried to persuade you that the nation-building process that has ripped through all of these multi-ethnic empires that were destroyed in the First World War and then recreated as nation-states, 1919, stuck different peoples together in one borders and told them to create a common constitution and a common organic community. It failed. Great sorting out, long and bloody, zero-sum game for minorities. This is about nation building. It's about creating a community where people feel like they're living next to their neighbors. And it's had repercussions. The migrant flow going into Europe has caused a conservative backlash in Europe, the rise of right-wing parties. It's happened in the United States as well. And we're seeing, in a sense, a retreat away from a cosmopolitan idea of the nation, where immigrants can flow in, to a much more hunkered down, much more xenophobic and world where people are worried about their own nation, their group of people, about keeping the political organic community that they know and are attached to, and not letting it be undermined, violated, or perhaps attacked by these radical flows of new people. And that brings us to the end of this very dramatic period of war and turmoil, which has sent over 5 million Syrians into exile, displaced almost half of all Syrians, caused the death of 500,000 Syrians. And that's not to mention the amount of Iraqis that have been driven from their country. Even before the rise of ISIS, 4 million Iraqis fled their country after the American invasion. Most of the Christians left. Shiites gained power. And these civil wars that have racked this region are only at midpoint. We don't know how they will end.